You're listening to the Existential Lens, reflections on therapy, existence, and the human experience. I'm Evan Kaufman, a psychotherapist in Eugene, Oregon. My work is grounded in an existential humanistic approach to therapy, one that explores meaning, identity, freedom, and what it actually feels like to be a human being moving through the world. If you'd like to learn more about my practice or read the full Existential Lens blog, you can visit my website at evankaufman.org. There's also a link in the podcast description. This podcast is a space to slow down and reflect on the questions that shape us, the tensions we carry, the patterns we inhabit, and the deeper layers of psychology that don't always get spoken aloud in the therapy room. It's created for clients, fellow clinicians, and anyone interested in places where philosophy, psychology, and the work of living a meaningful life intersect. The title of today's podcast is The Paradox of Free Will in Therapy. Why does free will matter, and why am I talking about it? I think it's central to the idea of what therapy is. And I think this is applicable to any kind of psychotherapy, from CBT to my work as an existential humanist, to someone who's a psychoanalyst, or anything that's out there. We believe as clinicians, as therapists, that our actions working with our clients help to better their lives. We might bring them into coherence with a more authentic way of being. We might help them change something that feels broken or stuck in their lives. And ultimately, there is this engagement with agency, or our free will, to help that client take a little bit of ownership over their life and change it into a direction that feels more aligned, congruent, or is better fitted to achieve the things they want to see out of life. And if a client believes that they have agency over their life and their choices actually matter, that they have weight, then it becomes easier to move towards those changes they want to see. But if people believe that they don't have agency, that their patterns are fixed, or that the systems they're embedded in, be it culture or work or their family, really limit them or constrict them heavily, then change can become more difficult. And I would suggest in some cases, people really feel like change becomes nearly impossible, as if free will doesn't exist anymore. And this shows up in lots of different ways. This diminished agency is really what inspired me to make this podcast. And I noticed this broad theme within all my clients coming from different economic backgrounds, different identities, different ways of seeing themselves, that they all were struggling with more or less different themes around how their agency was limited. And this limiting of agency, I think, is something very alive within our culture today. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that now. So what do I mean by this cultural mood of diminished agency? This is a complicated topic, and I certainly don't have a full understanding of it. But broadly, I've started to think about this in a few different pieces. The first is maybe technology and the role it plays in our lives. The author Yanis Vassiliadis calls this techno-feudalism, the idea that most people have become digital serfs, and that there are these techno-feudalist overlords now, Google, Microsoft, Apple, NVIDIA, et cetera, that really control the way our reality is constructed. They're literally defining the operating systems by which we live our lives by now. And that us as individuals are really sort of beholden to these techno-feudalist overlords. And so our agency to act is sort of defined by them more than we can define it ourselves. Now, I don't know if Vassiliadis' claim is completely true, and he even says as such in his book that this is just one way to see the world, maybe not the ultimately correct way. But I do think this piece about technology is really impacting people quite profoundly when it comes to exercising their free will and ability to change and inhabit the lives they want to. The next piece is economic. And this is partly connected to the tech piece. It's partly connected to globalism. It's very complicated. It's partly political too. And that, I think broadly what I could say is that people feel like their lives are just more constricted economically, that there's not only is there scarcity of resources, but the ability to make a livelihood is just, there's less lanes available. There's not as many choices as there used to be. It's harder to do certain things as well. There's lots of barriers where in the past there wasn't as many. Another piece to this is climate. We live amongst this backdrop of this concern in our collective psyche about climate change and sort of the impacts it's having on our life. And this is connected to the other things, especially to globalism. But that anxiety is really there, and I think underneath a lot of our cultural concerns at the moment. And all these things, these different pieces from tech to economic to climate, there's probably many others that I'm not naming right now. They ultimately create a situation where most people feel sort of in this chronic helplessness state, that they can make some changes, but structurally they're in these systems that feel quite constricted. There's a philosophical term I'd like to add into the conversation now. This comes from Martin Heidegger, and this word is called throwedness. And what Heidegger means by that word is that we're thrown into our existence. What's really important to understand from an existential perspective is that throwedness doesn't mean that it erases freedom, but that it contextualizes it. In therapy, people really desire change, but as I've discussed, they feel like they lack the capacity to choose differently. And this core tension sets up this paradox of free will, that we want to be agents that can make changes, but we feel like we can't. There's sort of a dance there that we have to contend with. So overall, modern life, it's very difficult. There are all these structural ways in which we have limited agency. And this is added up, I think, to this cultural sense right now that maybe free will doesn't exist. Or if it does exist, it exists in a very small way. In this view, what is called hard determinism has become quite popular. I can think of several different people in sort of the information spaces on the internet that talk about it quite actively and promote the idea. And one of the largest names that I can think of is Sam Harris. And the conversation he's trying to add to, I think, is very nuanced and complex. But he does, in the overall kind of a stance that he takes on free will, he says that it doesn't exist, that it's an illusion, that we can trace every decision we make back to a prior cause, ad infinitum to the origin of the universe, and that our sort of ability to make choices is actually a sort of cognitive trick that consciousness plays on us so that we think that we're active agents and that we have this kind of choice in the life and we can move forward and we have this will to live. But actually underneath, it's just an illusion. Now, I don't agree with this. And I'm going to give you a lot of different reasons why I don't think this is true. But I'd like to start from a place of just proposing that our existence is a possibility space and that it's not a simple yes or no binary. That our existence is shaped by our context, and yet it's expanded by awareness. And as we expand our awareness, our ability to make choices improves, that we can start to cultivate a reality that's more coherent with what we want out of the world. And I really believe the work in therapy is to do this. This widening of awareness gives people the ability to make better choices. So from this idea that free will is maybe not just a binary of yes or no, and as a possibility space, I'm going to explore three different kind of critiques or ideas for you to think about with me. The first idea is how consciousness is active. Harris sees consciousness as a passive window or experience, and that what we perceive as choices really don't exist. They're illusions. Now, the existential humanistic tradition, which I'm part of, sees consciousness as interpretive, it's reflective, it's really where meaning-making happens, it's self-oriented, and it's capable of changing how future experiences unfold. One way you can kind of think about consciousness in its totality is that it is sort of this emergent property of our existence, And it has a hallucinatory quality. And there is something that's very elusive about it. And I think Sam's kind of use of this idea of it's an illusion is not completely incorrect. There is an illusion sort of going on. But notice how the illusion of consciousness, it does influence the causes that happen after it. And so when you examine the causal chain of experience, what you'll notice is that the hallucination of consciousness, the illusion of it, in quotes, is actually included within the different things that have happened in our lives. This kind of active observation, this experiencing of the world, this loop, influences what happens next in this way in which it can't be refuted. And if you see consciousness as actually being caused and it exists as a thing, then of course it's going to have an impact on the world. And even if free will in those moments is not large, that sort of loop that's created of consciousness does have a kind of effect. And if you recognize that consciousness even exists, actually, I believe that you can't possibly say determinism can be absolute, because for it to exist means that it has an impact on what's going to happen next. The next thing I'd like us to think about together is how constrained freedom is still freedom. Our modern culture, partially because of our politics, because of how we consume information, it likes to think in these binaries, these ultimate yes or no propositions. And we think of freedom like this. We think if constraints exist, freedom is an illusion. That's kind of how our mind works, this very logical sort of shape. Constraints equals no choice. And if influences shape you, you don't have a choice in the matter. But I think we're missing a big piece here. And we're not seeing it kind of probabilistically, or how there's lots of room inside that to have agency in the world. And consider with me these three ideas that I think highlight the problem very precisely. You cannot fly, but you have choices where you want to walk. You can't erase your past, but you can change your stance toward it. And you can't choose your genetics, but you can choose your habits. So if you consider those things, it becomes clear that those are all constraints, but you still have choices within those constraints. The overarching existential point here is that freedom is always ambiguous. It doesn't exist in these yes or no binaries. The next piece I'd like to talk about is how human change contradicts pure determinism. And this is really a subjective piece. It's hard to back up with facts and data, but if determinism were total, I don't think we would see addiction recovery. We wouldn't see patterns of past abuse and trauma to be recovered from. And people make dramatic changes in therapy doing these things. And I've seen it with my own eyes, how just through sort of being present, bringing awareness, talking with someone, how over time that really does shift the patterns they have in their life. And they make giant changes. And I've seen firsthand how expanding awareness really does give people the capacity to make better choices in their lives. So as we understand that, there's this missing piece that starts to emerge, I think. And as a solution to that binary of either it exists or it doesn't exist. And what I would call this missing distinction is choice versus capacity. So choice we can think of as the moment of action. Okay, that's a piece of free will or of our agency. But then there's also our capacity. And that capacity is like the inner space that allows choice to occur. Most clients that I see are not lacking choices, but what they are lacking is a capacity to choose. And they're overwhelmed with trauma, shame, the context of their lives, internal conflicts. And really, that's the place where therapy affects. Therapy doesn't manufacture new choices. It doesn't create them for clients. What it does is it restores their capacity to see choices and act on them. So as we bring awareness into the space and into the client's life, they start to gain a bigger sense of capacity. And that capacity expansion is really a core idea that's important within existential humanistic therapy, the work that I really do. And I see it really does work, that actively expanding capacity gives people the ability to make better choices. So from all these different pieces, the way that I've begun to think about free will is that free will exists on a gradient. So freedom exists on a continuum. It's not a yes or no proposition. We can think about how our conditions vary and we have different amounts of free will. Think about for a moment some extremes with me. So say a billionaire. Where is a billionaire going to fly for dinner or go to dinner? Huge amount of freedom, right? They have lots of choice. And think about then someone who's in a prison cell. Where are they going to go for dinner? Well, the dinner's probably going to come to them, right? And so their choice and freedom is really constricted. So we can see how there's this gradient that exists. But there's a little more nuance here, and I'd like to bring in the work of Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And in this book, he was interned in a Nazi concentration camp and ultimately came to this realization that we do have a sense of internal freedom that exists, even under extreme constraints. And that internal freedom, how we relate to ourselves, is really at the very basis of this idea of free will. So there's this observer bias that we have that we say, well, the billionaire has more freedom, the person in jail has less. But I think our total freedom that we have is a lot more than just our circumstances. And if we hang for a minute more in this space where we see this internal sense of freedom, how we relate back to ourselves as being the linchpin about how to work with free will, we start to see how personal, how political, and broader cultural issues come into clearer focus and why there's so many problems within our society about agency and choice. We're constantly confusing as a society our context with our destiny. We're seeing constraints as being how we're helpless. And then we're seeing how our influences are limited and that the only possibility is total determinism out of this. And if we go back to Viktor Frankl, if we go back to seeing free will as a gradient, we start to see that greater awareness, it expands that possibility space. It gives us more capacity. So we're not overwhelmed in the moment, and how we don't just get caught in our context, so that ultimately we can make better choices that bring our life into greater coherence with who we want to be in the world. So now I'd like to take you through a personal reflection on this capacity building aspect of free will, how awareness creates our ability to make better choices. And this is one from my own life. Many years ago, I was working as a commercial photographer, and I was really enjoying that work. I really like creative pursuit, and I'm a very visual person, very enjoyable in terms of the day-to-day work. But I was feeling like there was something stagnant on that path, that I wasn't connecting with people really how I wanted to in a deeper way. I had worked previously in management in prior jobs and really enjoyed that space of being with others more day to day. Photography is work that is often very much alone. You're not working with people a lot. Of course, clients and people you're photographing, but a lot of the work is spent in front of a computer, not really working with others. And I just knew something needed to shift, and that I wanted to bring myself into a kind of a greater sense of alignment with my life. There was no sudden realization where I realized, I know what I'm going to do now. There was just sort of a gradual awareness building process I went through in my own sort of internal work to figure out what I wanted to do. And I had at the same time my wife telling me, you need to make a choice about what you're going to do with your life. And there's this kind of like, I guess, hard limit, a day that I had to actually choose what was going to occur. And as I paid closer and closer attention to myself and clarified my direction, I journaled about it, I wrote about it, I thought about it, I made art about it. I did all these things to sort of build capacity. Eventually, I had to make this choice on what to do, and this awareness didn't make the decision necessarily easier or really easy at all, but it gave me the ability to see the possibility space I was working within. And what I saw there is that I really wanted to work directly with others, but also take that creative element and put it into the work, and saw how it was obvious that one of the best jobs for me would be to be a therapist, that it took everything that I had before me and it made sense within this constellation of possibility spaces that I had expanded into, and it was the choice that eventually I made. And I got to tell you, when I made it, I was pretty concerned that was the wrong choice. But I stand here before you now, many years later, and feeling like it was absolutely the best choice I could have made. And it's really obvious to me looking back that because of that expansion of my possibility space, of giving me that greater capacity to see the choices and possibilities in front of me, I was able to make a good choice, and one that so far is working out. So as we get towards the end of today's episode, I'd like to offer you an opportunity for a reflection of your own on this process. So take a moment and kind of get settled in yourself. And think of a place in your life where you feel acted upon, something that is difficult or you feel encumbered upon. It could be the broader culture. It could be within your own life, your work, your family, whatever it is. And just be with that for a moment. And then shift your attention just a little bit to where you might have even 1% of choice, even a tiny shred of choice. And that could be choice to take action externally and do something, or it could be a little bit of an opportunity to look at yourself in a new way, to choose how you relate to yourself. And consider what constraints are shaping you right now, how you're limited. But then as you pay attention to that, then consider what freedom you have within those constraints. And as you start to notice what's coming up for you right now, ask yourself, what would it mean to take your own consciousness seriously as a source of change? Well, thanks for hanging in there with me today. I hope that this topic has invigorated you to think about free will in your own life and how you might build your capacity to broaden your possibility space. If you'd like to learn more about me or my work, you can visit my website at evankaufman.org. You can find a link in the podcast description.